Δηλαδή αυτός που συνομιλεί, λέω ότι ο Μίχος.
Καλησπέρα σας, Γιώργος Νικολόπουλος.
Hello.
Hello, good evening. George Nikolopoulos from Athens.
Oh, is it George? It's
Yes.
Liv, but I don't know how to get on the photo.
Liv, good
Yes.
afternoon.
Okay.
Maria.
Okay.
But I don't know how to get on I would love to get my picture up, but how do I do it? Yes.
The first time
I see you.
it's up, it's okay.
It's wonderful to see you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks to you. I will see how I do it. I see that. That's the Zoom meeting. Yeah, 44, that's great.
The company that manufactures the filters has redesigned them to prevent collapse and powder contamination. For their outstanding courage and skill.
Αγαπητοί φίλοι, τιμάτε απόψε με την παρουσία σας, είναι μεγάλη μας τιμή. Είναι το δεύτερο σεμινάριο που οργανώνει η Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση Ομοτήμων Καθηγητών. 3 από εδώ είμαστε μέλη μιας ομάδας εργασίας πρόληψης και προαγωγής της υγείας. Ο συμπρόεδρος μου ο κύριος Χριστοδούλου, ο καθηγητής ο κύριος Μπεχράκης και ο ομιλών, και θα δείτε και τα υπόλοιπα μέλη της ομάδος αυτής, και αυτό το δεύτερο σεμινάριο που οργανώνουμε μετά από μία συνάντηση το Δεκέμβριο, και σκεφτήκαμε να μιλήσουμε για τον long COVID άρρωστο, γιατί είναι κάτι που όλοι το αντιμετωπίζουμε όσοι από εμάς είναι γιατροί στους ασθενείς μας, αλλά και ως άνθρωποι. Θα μας επιτρέψετε να συνεχίσουμε στα αγγλικά από εδώ και πέρα, γιατί είναι ευρωπαϊκό το συνέδριο και η κυρία παρακολούθησης είναι διαδικτυακή. Στο προηγούμενο που είχαμε κάνει είχαμε 256 εγγεγραμμένους. Το σεμινάριο αυτό τελεί υπό την αιγίδα του Πανεπιστημίου Αθηνών. Dear friends, welcome from all over Europe and hopefully from even further. We know that we have some friends from British Columbia participating. This is our second seminar of the Committee on Prevention and Health Promotion. And we have a very good panel of discussants and presenters. This seminar is under the auspices of the University of Athens, and our rector, Professor Athanasios Dimopoulos, will give an address, an opening address. I must say that Professor Dimopoulos, as a very prominent physician, has been very active in Greece in combating the COVID-19 pandemic. Professor Dimopoulos will give his address.
Dear Professor Kokinos, dear colleagues, dear friends, welcome. I would like to thank all the distinguished members of the organizing committee for their tremendous support, having put together this engaging program. Long COVID conditions are a wide range of new, returning or ongoing health problems that people experience after being infected with the virus that causes COVID-19. Most people with COVID-19 get better within a few days to a few weeks after infection. So at least 4 weeks after infection is the start of when post-COVID conditions can be first identified. Anyone who has been infected with SARS-CoV-2 can experience post-COVID conditions. Most people experience symptoms days after first learning they had COVID-19, but some people may present with post-COVID symptoms without knowing that they got infected. There is no test to diagnose long COVID-19, and people may have a wide variety of symptoms that could be related to other health problems as well. This can make it difficult for healthcare providers to recognize post-COVID conditions. People with post-COVID conditions can have a wide range of symptoms that can last more than 4 weeks or even months after infection. Sometimes the symptoms can even go away or can come back again. Post-COVID conditions may not affect everyone the same way. People with post-COVID condition may experience various health problems and combinations of symptoms happening over different lengths of time. Most patients' symptoms slowly improve with time. However, for some people, post-COVID conditions may last for months, weeks, or longer after COVID-19 illness and can sometimes result in disability. The best way to prevent post-COVID conditions is to protect yourselves and others from being infected. For people who are eligible, getting vaccinated and staying up to date with vaccines against COVID-19 can help prevent COVID-19 infections and protect against several illnesses. Estimates of the proportion of people who can have COVID-19 that go on to experience post-COVID conditions may vary. 13% at 1 month or longer after infection, 2.5% at 3 months or longer based on self-reporting, more than 30% at 6 months among patients who have been hospitalized. Under this prisma, it is of extreme importance to identify the most frequent symptoms and diagnoses experienced by patients with post-COVID conditions, understand how many people are infected by these conditions and how often people who are infected with COVID-19 will develop a long COVID syndrome. Furthermore, we should understand the role of vaccination in preventing post-COVID-19 conditions and collaborate with professional medical groups to develop and offer clinical guidance and other educational material for healthcare providers, patients, and the public. Thank you.
We want to thank our rector. I must say, and Professor Christodoulou can attest to that he has been very helpful from the initiation on of the European Association of Professors Emeriti. Our inaugural session, opening Congress, was at the Great Hall of the University of Athens. So the University of Athens has helped EAPE very much. George.
Αγαπητοί φίλοι, θα ήθελα και εγώ να σας καλωσορίσω στη σημερινή μας συνάντηση, η οποία αναφέρεται σε ένα θέμα εξαιρετικά επίκαιρο, που απασχολεί τους επιστήμονες σε πολλές χώρες, και όχι μόνο τους επιστήμονες στον χώρο της ιατρικής, αλλά και ευρύτερα της κοινωνιολογίας, της ψυχολογίας και διαφόρων άλλων επιστημών, και αυτό είναι το γνωστό μας post-COVID syndrome, το μετά-COVID σύνδρομο. Είναι μεγάλη μου ευχαρίστηση που συμμετέχω εδώ και συμπροεδρεύω με τον Διονύση, ο οποίος είναι η φλόγα τέλος πάντων της επιτροπής αυτής που έχουμε κάνει, και με τη δραστηριότητα που τον χαρακτηρίζει και την ενεργητικότητά του κατάφερε να ιδρύσει αυτή την Committee on Prevention and Health Promotion με τη συνεργασία μας, η οποία οργανώνει, όπως είπαμε, το δεύτερο σεμινάριό της. It is a great pleasure, dear friends, for me to co-chair this session, which was initiated by three of us. I think Dionysios Kokinos was the main figure in the initiation of this committee. And we're very glad that we will deal with a topic of such importance as the post-COVID syndrome is. I would like to introduce to you the president of the European Association of Professors Emeriti, who is the person that you can see in the picture, and this is Sir Leslie Ebdon. We're collaborating with Les in the association in a very constructive way, I think. And with your permission, I will say certain things about his biography. So, Sir Leslie Ebdon is former Vice Chancellor of the University of Bedfordshire, and he is Director of Fair Access to Higher Education, which is very important. He attended Hemel Hempstead Grammar School. Then he obtained, later on, he obtained his Bachelor of Science in Chemistry in 1968, and a PhD at the Imperial College in London in 1971. After lecturing at Makerere University in Kampala and Sheffield City Polytechnic from 1973 to 1980, he joined what is now the University of Plymouth in 1981 as a lecturer in analytical chemistry. In 1989, he was promoted to head of Department of Environmental Sciences, and eventually he rose to Deputy Vice Chancellor in Academic Development. Leslie's research interests are in environmental analytical chemistry, and he has produced over 250 publications and obtained several awards. He was knighted in the 2018 birthday honors in recognition of services to higher education and social mobility. He was named one of Britain's 500 most influential people, and he was appointed Commander of the Order of the British Empire before his knighthood in 2009. In 1995, the American Microchemical Society awarded him the Benedetti-Pitcher Medal for outstanding contributions to microchemistry. And he obtained a number of other distinctions, which I will not mention. The only thing I would like to mention concerns, first, the personality of Les, because he's a very humorous man, and I very much appreciate his humor. I can bring you some paradigms of this humor, but we don't have much time. And the second important contribution is in equity in education. Aristotle said that there is no greater injustice than treating unequal persons in an equal way. And along these lines, I think Les Ebdon has worked to upgrade the opportunities for people who are poor and disadvantaged. And this is something that I believe has contributed to his knighthood. Right? Leslie? Yes? Yes. So it's a great pleasure to introduce to you Sir Leslie Ebdon, the President of the European Association of Professors Emeriti.
Well, thank you very much indeed, George. I'm sitting here slightly embarrassed at such an extravagant introduction, but thank you very much. And if anybody is in any doubt, the fact that I was supposed to be one of the 500 most influential people in England is proof that there are less than 500 people with any influence whatsoever in this country. But it's good to be with you, and it's a great honor, in fact, on behalf of the European Association of Professors Emeriti, to welcome you to this important meeting, and in particular, the meeting of the Committee of Prevention and Health Promotion of the European Association of Professors Emeriti, on the long COVID patient. I'm delighted too that we have the collaboration of the Pasteur Hellenic Institute, Protovolea, and the Hellenic Cancer Society, and the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. ERP exists to ensure that the human capital of knowledge, that capital of leading experts who became professors and are now retired professors emeriti, is used for the betterment of our world. And it's open to all retired professors. We organize meetings like this, we have congresses, we publish a regular bulletin, and we're actively seeking new members. So if you'd like to join, please ask Dennis or George about that. But enough of the commercials. Only yesterday, in fact, Dr. Anthony Fauci, America's famous infectious disease expert, warned that long COVID-19 represents an insidious public health emergency for millions of people. He stressed the importance of continuing research. The World Health Organization believes that between 10 and 20% of COVID-19 survivors have been left with lasting symptoms, including breathlessness, fatigue, and cognitive dysfunction. That can persist long after the acute infection has resolved. The mechanisms for these symptoms remain mysterious, yet the impact on individuals, society, and the economy is severe. So I welcome today's seminar as part of the scientific discussions and research exchange that must urgently seek to bring relief to the long COVID-19 patient. And it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Les, for this excellent introduction. Dear friends, I want to stress one element of our association, which I believe is vital for any group, association, or council: the spirit of friendliness and openness among its members. And each president succeed in each other in a friendly and fraternal way. I believe with my follower, Professor De Santo from Naples, and now with Professor Les Ebdon, and our next president, Professor Christodoulou, we keep a chain, as I like to call it, of dignified friends. And this is important for any association. Thank you very much, President. And we moved our first speaker, who is Professor Patrick Burch, who actually is the treasurer of our association. Professor Patrick Burch has an illustrious career in medicine. He's Professor Emeritus of Microbiology in the University of Paris, Descartes, and he's a member of the very prestigious National Academy of Medicine of France. And Professor Burch is leading the various publications of the National Academy of France against COVID. So he's considered a worldwide authority in COVID. He trained in Paris in the Faculty of Medicine, at the Trudeau Institute in New York. He was chief of the department of Grand Chef, Patrick, and Grand Chef of the Department of Microbiology at the well-known Necker Enfants Malades Hôpital in Paris, and director of the also important INSERM research unit. He's director of the Pasteur Institute of Lille, Mrs. Stylianopoulou, so he's a colleague of yours, and he has published many articles and many books. Before giving the lecture to our dear friend, Professor Burch, I must say that in this tonight's event, apart from EAPE, we have the Pasteur Institute, the Hellenic Society of Cancer, and also we have the Biomedical Research Foundation of the Academy of Athens. But Patrick, first, we are very happy to present the message from our Deputy Minister of Health, Professor Mina Gaga. Dr. Gaga is a very active fighting physician who in her hospital Sotiria, one of the main hospitals of Athens, was very active in combating COVID-19. So Deputy Minister Mina Gaga will give a brief address, please.
Good afternoon. This is a great initiative regarding the long COVID syndrome, and I'm really happy you're all gathered here, and thank you for the invitation. I'm a pulmonologist by training. I've had to deal with COVID patients, and we instituted one of the long COVID outpatient clinics, and one of my closest collaborators will talk to you about the long COVID syndrome today, Dr. Iris Vlachandoni, who had patients both in the UK and in Greece. But what we all need to know is that this is a very important syndrome that can really deteriorate the lives of the patients who have it, and it's very important to deal with it, both on the side of the state and on the side of the healthcare workers. So I wish you every success with this event, and the Greek state is here to help every long COVID patient. Thank you.
Professor Gaga is traveling tonight in her capacity of Deputy Minister in an important meeting. So, Patrick, I'm sure you will agree with all of us that beauty first. So, after Professor Gaga, it is your turn, please.
Thank you, Dennis, very much for your kind presentation. And Thank you for the organizer for inviting me. I will speak about the COVID-19 pandemic in a syndemic perspective. So everybody knows that the COVID-19 pandemic started in Wuhan on this famous seafood market in December 2019. Wuhan is a very busy city of 11 million in a region of Hubei with 58 million. And this virus changed this city for 3 months due to the lockdown in January 21. So the very beginning of the pandemic start, as I say, in Wuhan, officially the 1st of December by unknown pneumonia. The first death occur in the January 9 and January 14, and the lockdown was declared on January 23rd, in general lockdown of the region and then of the whole country. The retrospective official survey indicates that the first cases occur in November 17 and December 15, you have 27 cases, and in December 20th, we have 60 cases. After, you have this huge number of contaminated patients, and then you have this rapid decline due to the lockdown, certainly. So the symptoms of COVID-19 are very well known: short incubation, acute respiratory disease. Most people, obviously, fortunately, have mild symptoms, 85%, with fever, fatigue, headaches, dry cough, sore throat, rhinitis, sneezing, diarrhea in some cases, and anosmia agusia as neurologic symptoms. In 15% of cases, you have severe symptoms: acute respiratory distress, pulmonary embolisms, myocarditis, neurological symptoms, and multivisceral failures. But many people are totally asymptomatic and short-term carrier, usually short-term carrier. So the global lethality, that's to say, the number of dead according to the number of symptomatic people, it's evaluated to about 0.6%, but it can reach, in the southern country, in poor country, 1 to 2%. And at the beginning of the pandemic, it was evident that most victims were people older than 60 or people with high risk, like with comorbidity like diabetes or hypertension. And the mortality also was very important in all people here. The first trimester, you have about 30% of the people died over 80. Few words about the long COVID-19 or post-acute COVID syndrome. It's a prolongation of the clinical symptoms. It can go to occur in 30% of the symptomatic patient, and even sometimes it can occur in non-symptomatic patient. The WHO estimate today that you have 17 million people in Europe which have suffered of this long COVID-19. The pathophysiology is based on 3 things: the persistence of the viral replication in some tissues, like the brain, the lungs, the blood vessels, the chronic inflammatory reaction, and microthrombi and microbleeding. That's the cardinal symptoms of this long COVID. But you will have more information by the other conference. So after the beginning of the pandemic, the emergence of the pandemic in Wuhan, we assist to a rapid early spreading all over China. You see the original focus was there, and after it spread, and the official the official policy was COVID-0, even now, with a strict containment. Strict containment is something very difficult to follow. And the global survey, according to the Chinese authority, is altogether, for the confirmed cases, 84,000 people, and for the death, less than 5,000. So certainly these figures are very underestimated, and probably you have much more victims of the pandemics in China. After 3 months, in April, for example, the first wave occurred all over the world. And you see the China, obviously, but also Europe and North America. And the Africa was partly spare, and South Africa was not very strongly at that time. But the WHO indicates that you have 2.6 million people with confirmed cases and already 184,000 deaths. This rapid spreading of the virus SARS-CoV-2 in the world is due to the fact that the COVID-19 is an airborne respiratory disease. The contagiousness is very high. It's about 3. The R0 is between 2.5 and 3.5. And that occurs in a world at risk of pandemic for 2 reasons. The first reason is the dissemination of the SARS-CoV-2 through airplanes. Here you have the picture of the air transplantation in 2019. You know that 4.3 billion passengers a year for this year before the pandemics. And you have also tight connection between China and the Western countries. You see between Shanghai, Wuhan, Beijing, with Europe and South America and North America. And you see the connection with Africa and with South America were not that important. And it's the reason why you have this predominancy in Europe and in America, North America. The second reason is the huge urbanization and the emergence of megacity. If you look at this map in 1960, in the 60s, you see 2 or 3 megacity. Megacity is city up to 10 million, and today up to 33 million for a single city. And you see, it is expected in 2030 that many mega city will exist in China, in India, even in Africa, where you have nothing in the 60s, and in South America. So this is a very important phenomenon that favor pandemics. And if you consider now the urban population as regard to the rural population, you see at the present time, you have 50% of the human population of 8 billion, which are in cities, and it's expected in the 50s that you have 5.7 billion in the cities and 3.2 billion in the rural population. So the SARS-CoV-2, COVID-2, everybody knows that it's a coronavirus with a spike protein which play an important role for the penetration of the virus in the cells through specific receptor, S2 and human receptor specific. And we know that in human population, we have 7 coronavirus, but 3 give severe respiratory disease. You have the SARS-CoV-2, COVID-1, in 2002 with almost 8% of mortality, the MERS-CoV with 34% of mortality, and the SARS-CoV-2 with 0.6 to 2% of mortality. The 2 first were not very contagious. it's a reason why it's very different for the SARS-CoV-2, less lethal and much more contagious. The origin of the virus is very controversial. Most scientists today say that it's a natural origin from bats directly to the human population, or we did not found intermediate host, and the direct adaptation, we have no convincing evidence of that, but it is the way most people believe. The alternative is a laboratory accident, and it's very controversial. I will not elaborate on that. So one characteristic of the SARS-CoV-2 is its rapid evolution through mutations. You have, you see, for the first months of the pandemic, you have here the nucleotide sequence of the virus, and you see the rapid diversification of the virus at the very beginning, and after it go on, and it explain the COVID-19 pandemics, which evolved by waves. The waves are due to mutation in spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 and rapid decline of the humoral immunity, which is unusual for the virus. Usually we have a strong immunity, and you have these waves, and at the present time we have 7 waves at least. And the survey in October 22 is officially 2,021 million cases, and officially 4.7 million dead, but according to the WHO, you have 17 million deaths at the present time. These waves are due to the kinetics of the variant. You see here a recent publication showing the different mutants, which one mutant emerge and become predominant, and mentality, belief, fears, rumors, fake news, and standard of living, obviously, housing, sanitary promiscuity. And finally, the health status of the population, co-infection, comorbidities, and nutritional status or genetic factors. So the COVID-19 syndemic can be illustrated by this title of an article in Nature in 21, how COVID is derailing the fight against HIV, TB, and malaria. The pandemic's effect on other infectious diseases could exceed the direct impact of COVID-19. So the importance of the psychological factor, I have to add, a new disease questioning the social organizations, the habits, certainties, incomprehension, distrust, fear, stress, behavior, stigmatization, and the phenomenon of scapegoats, underlying the importance of communication in transparency, rumors, and fake news. The COVID-19 also highlights social disparity and inequality in exposure, promiscuity related to cramped housing, precariousness, and risk behavior. And I will illustrate all that by the collateral effects of COVID-19 on global health. You see that's a report from the WHO in 2020. You have an increase of the number of cases of tuberculosis, increase of the number of AIDS in Africa, increase of malaria, decrease of the routine vaccination. 80 million children have not been vaccinated in Africa. The obviously stop of cancer treatment, increase of prematurity and maternal mortality in the third world, increase of unplanned pregnancy, poverty, strongest increase since 1945, non-infectious mortality, and mental illness and suicide. So the COVID-19 induced restricted access to care and medication, routine vaccination, contraception, anti-infectious drugs, rehydration salts, disinfestation campaign. And I will conclude by saying that the syndemic perspective is the COVID-19 pandemics must be considered globally, not only at the level of a country, but at the level of the whole world. The syndemic approach can lead to the effective multi-level prevention strategy, taking into account mentalities, socioeconomic, behavioral, environmental factors, climate change, air pollution, and so on. The reduction of the boundaries between disease and human and animal health encourage integrated approaches aligned with global health priority. So we have to switch from the anthropocentric view, where humans are at the top of the pyramid, to a global vision where humans are inside the living world as a living species. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Academician Burch, for this excellent exposure. And as a cardiologist, I may say that before the true pandemic came out, we used to say, the cardiologists, the epidemic of heart failure, the epidemic of diabetes. Now we saw which is the real pandemic. But you are correct, there is a complete chain of one problem affecting the other. And thank you very much for this excellent and keeping your time. Dear friends, we have a small change in the program. Our next speaker will not be Professor Beharakis, who will speak in the second session. Our next speaker is Professor Luigi Campanella, who will speak about the possibility of drug therapy in long COVID syndrome. Professor Campanella is a dear friend. He is the past General Secretary of EAPE, a professor of the University of Sapienza in Rome since 1980. He has been Dean of the faculty there, author of many publications, chairman and president of innumerable chemical societies, and he has been a visiting professor to many universities, and he has a very wide academic and educational activity over the years, and he has won many, many prizes. I hope where you finish, Luigi, you can tell us what was the Anasilaos Prize, because Anasilaos is a Greek word. Professor Campanella has a difficult job, because to speak about drugs in the long COVID is a little difficult, but I'm sure he will try to give us a very good view. Professor Campanella, you have the floor. Δώστε φωνή, παιδιά. Okay. Open your microphone, Luigi. Open your microphone. Open your microphone. Okay. Can you open your microphone, Luigi? Μίλα του εσύ, Αλέξανδρε. Put the unmute, Luigi. Push the unmute. Okay. Και χτες το προβάλαμε μια φορά. Κύριοι συνάδελφοι. Okay.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. So I wish to start just splitting these questions into three ones, because probably the problems are three, not only which drugs, but also where administered and when administered. So the first teaching of COVID is probably that we have made some mistakes in the times and in the place, because the times were too late and the places were the overcrowded hospitals, while it should have been much better if the time was the first symptoms and the place were the home of the single patients. So what we call medicine of a territory was forgotten during the time period, probably due to mistakes of the times before. But anyway, during COVID, surely we have lost medicine of territory. And so we have lost the figure of the doctors as sentinels of health, able so to make their counsel and their interventions at the right times. That means at the first symptoms. In this way, we should have been avoided that our hospital overcrowded were unable to sustain this weight, and the result, as you know, are the number of deaths and the dramatic situation we have faced during the COVID times. Looking at my central object of presentation, that is to answer the question, can therapy be efficacy? I want to recall you that really when we speak of therapy, we refer to three steps in the therapy that are the detection of the pathology, the therapy, and obviously the prevention about a back way of the pathology. So in order to have an efficacy from the treatment, we need that we face these three aspects of the therapy: detection, therapy in itself, and prevention. Detection, now we pass to see our subject, that is COVID. So detection of COVID, as many of you know, was got with different approach. Here I have remembered to you the most applied, that are the functional nucleic acids, the DNA enzymes and gene sequencing, the biologic approach by chips and paper-based biosensors. As you know, this mean had a very interesting development in the direction of the wearable biosensor that can be always with us and be really the sentinel about which I said before. After, we have a chemical quantitative polymerase chain reaction, amplification, as you know, supported by primers. And here, I want to focus about the role of chemistry and respect of this, because if you go to see the experimental condition of this fundamental reaction, you see that the conditions are the same since many years. There was no effort, according to me, to try to change this condition, because behind this condition there are commercial interests, because many systems in the market are based on this. But if we look at the primary interests of the patients, we also have to hypothesize that the conditions of the polymerase change reaction of amplification can be reconsidered, especially, and I speak here as chemist, from 2 points of view: the choice of pH of the reaction and the choice of the ionic strength value for the reaction. I cannot obviously enter then into these details, but I leave them to you as a reason of consideration. Finally, the detection can be based on the immunoassay antigen antibody, for which there is really a limit, and that is generally this immunoassay needs some additive treatment in order that sensitivity and specificity, that are two important characteristics of any detection process, must be or can be increased and improved. Then we have the therapy. I here report a list of the drugs used as anti-COVID, classified according their first origin. So we have immunomodulators. You can see reported in the slide some of the commercial most common drug. So immunomodulators, anti-inflammatory, anti-thrombotic, protease inhibitors, antiviral, anti-rheumatic, anti-malarial. I have put the interrogation marks because about this kind of drugs, there are some doubts in the literature, so that we can refer to them with some doubts about efficacy. Then monoclonal antibodies, with the problem of the very high expensive cost. Convalescent plasma, that is a more recent approach, that is the plasma from persons who suffered COVID. And finally, the Chinese medicine, that you know is very popular, is Ian's history, is surely a reason of seriety and of efficacy. You know that the medicine, the old Chinese medicine, has solved many dramatic situations of pathology. And about COVID, we have this Chinese ephedra, that is a product extracted naturally, that is able to close the door to virus. which are the science and the technologies involved in all these products I just listed before. Chemistry, biotechnology, immunology, epidemiology, but obviously medicine inside the problem. So the first is the mother. But recently, I have seen with great interest that also artificial intelligence, robotics, and cloud computing have contributed to improve the efficacy of some drugs against COVID. For instance, in literature, you can find model algorithms to predict how druggable a target is. And this is very important because sometimes the approach to natural compounds is more psychological than efficient. So to have the possibility to check about a possible drug, which is this really capacity to fight virus or any way a disease, a pathology, is obviously very, very important. I said before that probably the right place of some therapy were wrong because were the overcrowded hospital, while they should have been the homes, the houses. And there are domestic therapies applied, very known, and I want to recall to you that are the control of oxygen saturation, very important to see if there were some effects negative of COVID on our organism, corticosteroid and low molecular weight heparins, not steroidal anti-inflammatories, chloroquine and antibiotics, but here with some doubts according to literature about their efficacy, and hydration that must be continuous and controlled. There are some last news in the field of the drug, and here I have recalled you the most recent you can find in the literature. Paxlovid, that is advised for immunocompromised patients, that is an antiviral, but with the great attention to what? To what is saying alarm about this drug. New data about negative interaction with the therapies of cardiovascular pathologies, some antiarrhythmic and anticoagulants, with statins and with immunosuppressive agents. So the use of this drug, that for some aspect is an important step forward, must be done, run with caution, and especially controlling the patients to which is applied. Evusheld is also for immunocompromised patients. It is a combination of two monoclonal antibodies. Sotrovimab, especially useful against Omicron variant, that is a monoclonal antibody. Ivermectin, that is an anti-helminthing, and is a result to be very efficient. And this antiviral, especially studied for the possible new variant of COVID. The problems till to now, I have given you data, but behind each one of these, there is obviously the uncertainness of the research of the products, because behind any drug, there is always some aspects that can be not well known, that produce side effects. So in the case of the COVID drugs, we have some problems also. First one, the reproducibility. In chemistry, we consider a result accurate, that means true, only if the reproducibility, that we call precision also, is more than 90%. Generally, in the case of drug for COVID, this was reached, but in some cases, precision are lower than 70%. That means uncertainness about what we want to apply. The absence of blank data, and this is very important, but it's not easy for research in medicine to have a lot of persons able to represent a set of blank data. This lackness is a weak point. Experiments on animals, because many of these research started with experiments on animals. But in the moment which the actual, where medicine speaks of not illness, but of ill, that means to look at the person more than at the pathology, it seems sometimes problematic to transfer results from animal model to human model. Other problem is the Compatologist effect. There are many in the presentation by Patrick. There was the effect of combination of different pathology that can be interfere each other. And so the presence of this copathology is a reason of uncertainness about the effect of the drug. The gender effect is seen that sometimes the man organism answer differently from the woman organism. The influence of the commerce and the market, and the correlation between test in vitro and test in vivo, that obviously medicine try to overcome, to pass, but it remains that a thing is to work on cells in vitro, and things is to work on a full organism as in vivo. There are side effects about which I said already that must also be here recalled. And here I have listed the most common and popular you can find in literature about the announces of the persons who suffered COVID. Cardiovascular pathologies. I am personally an example. After the fourth vaccination, I suffered of a cardiological pathology, and I am not perfect, just as a result of the fourth vaccine. Nausea, vomit, diarrhea, headache, pressure alteration, dyspnea, angioedema, blood clot time variation, sweating. These are all side effects. And when they say side effect, we refer both to the illness, to the pathology, to the virus, and also to the vaccines needed to fight it. And so we arrive to the last part of my talk, that is about vaccines. We have 5 vaccines actually available, and here report them in order of time, since the most ancient to the most new. So here I recall you that the time needed for a good vaccine is not less than 12, 18 months. That means that research needs time and money to produce vaccines. The first one was produced was approved in December 2020. Here you can see his characteristics is the Pfizer-BioNTech, approved for older than 16 at the beginning, but then in November 2021 also opened to children with a third of a normal dose. Is a vaccine messenger RNA based, 2 doses, with the problem of the storage at minus 70 degrees. That is obviously not so available temperature. The second vaccine was produced in January, so less than 1 month after, is the Pivax Moderna, also based also on messenger RNA for all the person at the beginning, then approved also for more than 12 years, 2 doses, with the advantage in comparison with the Pfizer-BioNTech that the storage is possible at minus 20. That is much more, is much easier to be obtained. The third vaccine is at the end of January, so in the same, very near to the Moderna, and is the Vaxzevria vaccines. AstraZeneca as producer, recommended for older than 55 years at the beginning, then admitted for 55 years old, finally for older than 60. It was suspended for a certain time, then readmitted. Is based on adenovirus, that means the virus not able to be replicate. Some doubts about its efficacy in the literature and the experience in overall the world.
Professor Campanella, can you conclude in... yes, please.
Finish. The fourth vaccine is Janssen by Johnson & Johnson, approved for older than 60, single dose, genetic material of spike protein based, approved in March 2021. And finally, the last, that is the Novavax, that definite the proteic vaccine for older than 18, 2 doses, no storage problems, recombinant spike protein based with the saponin, and tested with an efficacy of 90%, approved in December 2021. These are the countries involved in the production. Germany, as you know, United States, England, Sweden, Russia, and Italy for vaccine not yet approved. New scientific instruments of the application of therapy are the artificial intelligence, robotics and cloud computing, and the diffusion of the knowledge. This is reason why open science and knowledge sharing become condition fundamental to fight a dangerous virus as COVID. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very detailed description. I want to keep your last sentence. You know, this was a calamity, the pandemic. No one doubts that. But it gave such an impetus to research that it will serve as a paradigm for many years to come, how a calamity, a pandemic or a war brings about new progress. So we must be courageous and optimistic that we shall rise above those, and Professor Campanella described them very well. Actually, yesterday, dear friends, I had my 5th vaccination, and I feel very well. I urge you all to have your vaccinations on time. Thank you, Professor Campanella. George, you have the...
Yes, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Dušica Lečić-Tosevski, who is a very important figure not only of Serbian psychiatry, but also of international psychiatry. She is a member of the Academy of Sciences and Arts, if I'm correct, in Serbia. She is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Belgrade, and she has been the director of the Institute of Mental Health. We have carried out quite a lot of projects together. So if I speak about her, indirectly I speak about myself. And for this reason, I will limit what I have to say to the essentials. And the essentials is that Dušica has written a great number of books on stress, which are based not only on theoretical academic knowledge, but also on her personal experience of what happened in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, during many calamities that happened there, a war, and then sanctions and bombings and various other things that have been described in books of great academic importance for everybody. In addition to that, she is president of the Psychiatric Association for Eastern Europe and the Balkans, of which I was the president some years ago. And also, she and her society, the Serbian Psychiatric Association, has been one of the 4 participants in the production of the well-known Athens Declaration against the war, which has been produced some years ago, but it's very relevant today in Ukraine and many other parts of the world. So it's a great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Dušica Lečić-Tosevski. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Christodoulou. I would like to thank you for kindly inviting me to participate in this important symposium, important seminar. Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ που με προσκαλέσατε στο αυτό το συνέδριο. I will speak about mental health in the time of Corona, and in order to fulfill my honorable task, I thought of speaking about stress of the pandemic. about mental health and COVID-19, about the consequences, acute and chronic, long COVID, challenges for psychiatry, and the lessons learned during the pandemics. During the time of the pandemics, I read again my favorite, one of my favorite authors, Albert Camus, who wrote the book The Plague. And I read again that book, The Plague, as many of the people around the world did during the pandemic. And I will quote here Camus, who said, "Indeed, we are all in front of the wall that plague built around us, and in its lethal shadow, we must build our salvation." COVID pandemic united the polarized world for some time by the outbreak. The statistics show, as of 3 days ago, that 220 countries and territories were affected, 629 million people affected also, and 6.5 million died due to pandemics. Of course, somatic and mental health was endangered, and the Pandora's box of many problems of Homo sapiens was opened. It is not strange that complex, and it is very important that complex psychosocial factors play a very major role in shaping the flow and destiny of all people, and I will touch some of those factors. By preparing this presentation, in preparation of this presentation, I remember English poet John Donne, who in his solemn 400-year-old poem against isolationism is resonating today. John Donne, in his meditation and devotions upon emergent occasions, wrote, "No man is an island entire of itself," and so no one was alone, no one was an island during the pandemics. John Donne also wrote that never sent to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. And I will try to explain why. Speaking about stress, I should mention, of course, that there are eustress, under which I am now experiencing this important talk to you, versus distress, which is pathological. Stress is a general adaptation syndrome very well described by Hans Selye 70 years ago, and has 3 stages. The first stage is alarm reaction stage with a well-known fight-or-flight reaction. The second stage is a resistance stage. And if it is prolonged, if the stress is prolonged, the stress hormones are secreted, blood pressure is elevated, and there is irritability, frustration, and poor concentration. And finally, the third stage is exhaustion stage, if the stress lasts long and if it is chronic, with exhaustion of physical, emotional, and mental abilities. What follows is hopelessness with fatigue, burnout, anxiety, depression, and low stress tolerance. Physical effects of stress are also important. They decrease immunity and become risk for stress-related diseases. However, the stress has multiple phases, and how it will manifest depends also on individual reactions that are very important, especially to me, whose favorite topic is personality and personality disorders. And about multiple phases of personality disorders, I wrote a chapter together with my collaborators in the Sage Handbook of Personality and Individual Differences. The time of Corona was time of crisis and challenges. The lockdown and COVID-19 were the words in year to 2020 in Oxford English Dictionary. In year 2021, the words related to vaccines have spiked in frequency due to COVID and those words were vax, double vax, unvaxxed, and anti-vaxxer, all seeing a surge in use. There is a drastic change of life in the whole world, with quarantine, curfew, imprisonment, especially of the elderly people. In our country, for 2 months, the people above 65 were not allowed to leave their homes, which was very difficult indeed. There was also physical isolation, not social isolation, it is usually called, but physical distance, which caused existential crisis. And as consequences, there were illnesses, restrictions, change of work and mobility, of social contacts and support, and lack of physical activity. I have written about our experience in Eastern Europe, an invited paper which was published in the World Social Psychiatry Journal. The stress of the pandemic was caused, of course, normal reaction to abnormal situation. Pandemic was abnormal, with fear, anxiety, and apathy in some people. But fear of the virus spread faster than the virus. And here I come to for whom the bell tolls, because no one was sure, shall we become ill and how the COVID-19 will develop. There was a fear of illness and death, loss of job, property, and loved ones, and also in some people, coronaphobia was developed. Physical isolation, exclusion, and separation from family and friends was very difficult, and it affected all, especially emotionally unstable and vulnerable personalities. Losses, final separations, without possibility to attend the final and bid the final farewell was very difficult for those who experienced losses. And then there was a digital intoxication with news, often with contradictory messages. And of course, no wonder that mental health was at risk and still is. What happened with mental health during COVID-19 pandemic? The pandemic was a global shock related to health, morbidity, and mortality. It disrupted sociocultural, economic, and political rhythm of life. And in United Nations in May 2020 had a declaration saying that although COVID-19 crisis is predominantly crisis of physical health, it will become mental health crisis if adequate action is not undertaken. The well-known dictum of WHO is no health without mental health. So good mental health is critical for functioning of societies. The president of WHO wrote that mental health care should be integral part of response to COVID-19. And World Psychiatric Association issued a position statement pointing out a specific role of psychiatrists as important during the pandemic. Psychiatric consequences of COVID may become and have become in some areas pandemic within pandemic. Some authors have warned, even called it tsunami. So mental health services must be boosted to deal with tsunami of cases after lockdown and other author wrote. There are increasing data about mental health problems of affected persons, as well as of health workers who were burnt out during the pandemic, especially those working at the front line. It is well known that psychological factors are a crucial part in public health management. There is also a relatively new concept, COVID health anxiety. Actually, health anxiety is a new concept which is different from hypochondriasis. It is excessive fear of illness with possible physical symptoms. Fear infection is normal, but the level of fear is important. People who have this health anxiety don't accept negative tests as valid. They continuously observe themselves, they search the internet, and then the vicious circle of high anxiety develops with symptoms and wrong interpretation. There's also some obsessive symptomatology and avoidant behavior. In some people, hypochondria developed and had malignant influence of internet and social networks in spreading the fear of vaccination, fear of illness, but also the fear of vaccination. And if not untreated, this health anxiety might develop to depression. What were the consequences of COVID-19 for mental health? Many mental health problems or disorders such as anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. For instance, in the United States of America, population in the first year of the pandemic had a triple increase of depression. There was also abuse of alcohol and substances, gambling, domestic violence, sleep disorders, insomnia. Insomnia was, by the way, one of the most Googled words during the pandemics. Also, previous mental disorders exacerbated in some people, and unfortunately, due to overload of sick people in other hospitals, there was limited access to mental health services. Now I will touch today's topic, post-COVID syndrome. After the end of the pandemic, there are psychosocial consequences of forced physical separations and normal pattern of individual and collective behavior. Long COVID is defined as the collective term to denote persistence of symptoms in those who have recovered from SARS-CoV-2 infection. Recovery from COVID-19 goes or is manifesting with some symptoms existing. The health effects of COVID-19 appear to be prolonged and can exert stress on the healthcare system. It could be related to organ damage, post-viral syndrome, post-critical care syndrome, and other manifestations. A meta-analytic study recently done in April 2022 found that post-COVID-19 condition prevalence as high, as substantial. Global estimated pooled prevalence of post-COVID-19 condition was 0.43, with three main symptoms: fatigue, shortness of breath, cognitive dysfunction with memory problems, so-called brain fog. There are chest pain, trouble speaking, anxiety and depression, muscle aches, fever, loss of smell, loss of taste. These symptoms may last from 3 to 9 months. Fortunately, it is not very frequent. I myself, who was vaccinated 3 times by Pfizer, developed COVID, but with mild symptoms, and I don't have prolonged post-COVID syndrome. However, there is no specific treatment. We already heard about it today, but what is recommended is, and what is necessary is multidisciplinary care with primary care physicians, rehab professionals, social care workers, and mental health specialists. In a study in 1,700 subjects, 6 months after hospitalization, done and published in Lancet, done in 2021, described fatigue and muscle weakness in as much as 63% of people who have long COVID, sleep problems in 1/4 of them, anxiety, depression in more than 20%, and a big retrospective study carried out 6 months after COVID has shown that people who were diagnosed with COVID-19, more than 230 people were studied, had increased incidence of neurological and psychiatric disorders. Anxious and affective disorders were also registered, depression, even mania. Somewhat rarer were neurologic disorders after intensive care. 7% had stroke, 2% had dementia. But the question is whether dementia was there before the development of COVID. Brain fog manifests as a disorder of executive function that makes basic cognitive tasks absurdly hard. And then there are also vertigo, forgetfulness, and dysarthria. But there are some questions that I will ask now, and I believe everyone is asking. Is prolonged COVID a new syndrome, or is it a post-viral syndrome? Don't we all, most of people who have flu, develop some problems after the flu? Therefore, I think that long COVID is a controversial concept. The question is it real or overrated? Is it already existing syndrome? Was it existing earlier, before the latest pandemic? Is it post-infectious myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, which is a well-known syndrome? Is it a consequence of other viruses? It is well known, for instance, that the person who had flu, as I mentioned, or Epstein-Barr virus, might have some consequences that last for weeks. So are we dealing with post-viral syndrome instead of long COVID is the question to be responded to in the future. There are many lessons learned from the pandemics. With new memories, with new knowledge, we have new memories. The fight against pandemic, however, is not a sprint but a marathon. It was shown all over the world. The pandemic showed frailty of societies. It led to many controversies, to many theories, to many fake news, as we heard already. But society should be ready for a new pandemic. The Lancet Commission a week ago published a paper with lessons for the future from the COVID-19 pandemic. And the Commission gave recommendations for successful fight against emerging infectious diseases, which might be possible in the future. Of course, significance of mental health should be important, is great, and should be mentioned in post-pandemic time. That's why I'm here today as a psychiatrist. What is needed is a strategic, long-term planning of prevention and mental health promotion, as today's committee deals with, and as today's seminar is dealing with. The role of psychiatrists is very important in support of patients and will be important in the future pandemics, in support of patients, colleagues, and public health system in response to the pandemic. And I will conclude here using Nietzschean term of eternal return. There were pandemics in the past, well-known flu pandemic in 1918. We can see people with masks as we carried them on during the pandemics. Even we do it, some of us do it now. So the pandemics were in the past. This particular pandemic took 50 million lives. There will be pandemics in the future, and we should be ready. There is also eternal return, unfortunately, of wars and sanctions. And I, as Professor Christodoulou, my colleague and dear friend who helped our country during the time of the sanctions and war, mentioned, I come from the country with wars and sanctions. They, unfortunately, are also returning, and as we can see in Eastern Europe today, and not only there, but in many, many spots on our planet. And I will quote here a sentence from the Ecclesiastes, which says, "There is nothing new in the world." Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Legic, for this very important and interesting exhibition of what we know from the mental health viewpoint on pandemics in general and disasters in general, but specifically with reference to this present disaster. I would agree with whatever you said. And by the way, I would like to mention about the findings of a research work we carried out 2 years ago, which showed increase in depression, anxiety, and stress, hypochondriacal or pseudo-hypochondriacal symptoms, obsessive compulsive symptomatology, and most of all, effect on the quality of life. But after 2 years, we carried out again research on the same subjects, and we found out that there was some improvement, but the basic situations persisted. And this is an indirect indication that the long COVID is indeed a reality. It's not a hallucination, it's not a dream. It produces quite a lot of symptoms that take a long time to recover. So it's a marathon, as you said. It's not 100 meters, it's a marathon race. So you have to be alert and deal basically with the mental health effects of it. This brain fog seems to be very catastrophic for the functioning of the brain and everyday work of people who have to do mental work. So thank you very much for this excellent exposition, and we look forward to further research.
Thank you. Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ.
Παρακαλούμε. Ευχαριστούμε και εμείς πολύ για την ωραία ομιλία.
Ευχαριστώ, Γιώργο.
Okay. So, Professor Katsilambros would like to pass some comments. He has expressed this wish, and I think we should give him this opportunity, provided he will be brief. So please, can we put through Professor Katsilambros? No, he's on computer. He's on the computer. Can he not be connected? Όχι. Όχι. Yes, yes.
I am connected. I am connected. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
So you have a new iPad, Nikos, eh? Congratulations.
Oh, it is not new. Anyway,
that's what it says here.
Anyway, it is very helpful.
Okay, Nikos, we are listening.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to congratulate you and Professor Kokinos, as well as the excellent speakers. The topic is very interesting, especially as it concerns the long COVID. I learned a lot from the psychiatric point of view. Another point of view is and Professor Kokinos can tell us a lot about that perhaps, are the cardiologic problems. And it is a special cardiologic attack. It is not usually the regular myocardial infarction. Anyway, also as it concerns the endocrines, it is known that with the first attack of COVID, the subcutaneous tissue is affected in a way that the biochemistry of the fat cells promote the possibility of fat deposit, in other words, in some way, obesity. In addition, I may say that unfortunately, it seems that in spite of the possibility to apply vaccines of different kinds, which have been extremely helpful in general in order to save many lives, in spite of that, the long COVID is there, independently, perhaps, if someone has been vaccinated or not. Thank you very much for this possibility, Professor Christodoulou, and again, both to you, presidents, as well as to the speakers, may I express again my sincere congratulations.
Thank you, Nikos, for this contribution, and I think it's time now to sit down and let the other panel...
Have our gracious host, Professor Stylianopoulou, and Professor Beharakis, who was one of the three that started all this in Greece. Thank you very much.
The three musketeers.
Yes.
Okay. So we move now to the second session. I'm very pleased that I will co-chair it with the co-chairman should be shown on the slide, please. Okay, afterwards. Okay, I'm co-chairing this session with Professor Guy de Backer from the University of Ghent. But before we move to the first, before we move to the first speaker, please permit me to take a few minutes to say a few words for the host of this seminar, the Hellenic Pasteur Institute, and one of the co-organizers, Πρωτοβουλία 1821-2021, the incentive 1821-2021. The Hellenic Pasteur Institute is the oldest biomedical research institute in Greece. It was founded in 1921. We just had our 100th-year anniversary 1 year ago in 2021. And for 100 years, it has been serving public health by excellence in research, public health services, and education. The Πρωτοβουλία initiative is a consortium of 16 foundations, the most important foundations in Greece in terms of public, the good of the public and culture and history. And the Hellenic Pasteur Institute, together with Protophilia, organized the first symposium, international symposium. It was a 4-day event in the beginning of the pandemic on COVID-19. And COVID-19 was looked at from different points of view. Of course, the medical epidemiological, but as well the legal point of view, issues of individual rights, historical, other pandemics. We heard about this today as well. And of course, the mental issues, which were so well presented now. So today's seminar is a very nice sequel to this first event that happened in 2021 during the pandemic. So we are very happy, both the Pasteur Institute, and I'm talking on behalf of the Protophilia, to be partners in today's seminar. So now we can move to the first speaker of this session, which is Professor, would you like to say something, Dr. De Becker, Professor De Becker?
Oh, I'm very pleased to be with you co-chairing the second session. Congratulations already for the organizers, and we look forward to an excellent second session. And please introduce the first speaker.
Okay.
Up to you.
Thank you very much. So the first speaker in this session is Professor Beharakis. It's my pleasure to introduce him. He's a very good colleague and a good friend from a long time ago. He finished his medical studies in the University of Athens Medical School, where he earned his first doctorate degree. Then he got a second doctoral degree, a PhD, from the University of McGill. He's board certified in 3 medical specialties: pulmonary medicine, respiratory medicine, internal medicine, and critical care medicine. He has experience and he has contributed to medical education in the Medical School of Athens through his position in the Department of Experimental Physiology, having as specialty, of course, what else? Respiratory medicine. He's the founder of George D. Beharakis Research Lab of the Hellenic Cancer Society. He's an investigator at the Biomedical Research Foundation of Athens Academy, and he's a focal point of the World Tobacco Organization for Tobacco Control in Greece. Actually, he's an expert on programs for tobacco control. Of course, he's an author of many publications, has many citations, and today he's the right person, the most appropriate person to talk to us about the respiratory symptoms of long COVID. Dr. Beharakis, Professor Beharakis.
Thank you for the kind introduction and the nice words. On behalf of the Hellenic Cancer Society, I welcome you all to the meeting of today. And in the next 20 minutes, I will talk about the respiratory manifestations of long COVID-19. The definition of long COVID, according to the World Health Organization, was finalized a few months ago in a Delphi consensus. And according to this definition, which is clearly presented in the literature today, post-COVID condition occurs in individuals with a history of probable or confirmed SARS-CoV-2 infection. Usually 3 months from the onset of the COVID-19, with symptoms that last 2 months and cannot be explained by an alternative diagnosis. Common symptoms include fatigue, shortness of breath, cognitive dysfunction, and also others, and generally have impact on everyday functioning. Symptoms may be new onset following initial recovery from an acute COVID-19 episode or persist from the initial illness. Symptoms may also fluctuate or relapse over time. I would emphasize in 2 points here. One is that COVID-19 must not be confirmed. It may be just probable. And the second is the time frame of the definition, which is 3 months after the disease, and it has to last for 2 months. This definition is based on the fact that COVID-19 is a multi-organ disease. It is clearly known today that COVID as a disease enters our body through the respiratory system mainly. But from this primary respiratory infection is spread and affects all the organs of human body. In this picture, I cannot see the name of the first author, but the reference is written below. You can see that heart, renal, pancreas, liver, uterus, brain, blood, and the whole body can be affected by the disease. And this is why we have the symptoms from all these or any one of these organs after the end of the acute phase of the disease. What is the prevalence of this COVID-19, post-COVID-19 syndrome? In this meta-analysis and review, which has been based on 353 case patients and 1,640,000 control patients, both groups were characterized by having at least one post-COVID condition. The case presentations had a total of 38.2 post-COVID syndrome and 16% the control patients only. As a result, it is 1 to 4 or 5 patients suffering from COVID that appear that are showing the syndrome after the end of their disease. In the same study, there is a result showing that people aging less than 65 have less possibilities to have the long COVID syndrome after the disease. The respiratory manifestations of long COVID syndrome are described in this slide. Respiratory symptoms, control of breathing disorders, respiratory muscle dysfunction, pulmonary function test abnormalities, radiological findings, pulmonary embolism, and pulmonary fibrosis are the total of these manifestations. And starting from the symptoms, I have to present you the results of another review and big meta-analysis based on 13 original papers, showing that prevalence of dyspnea and cough are the prominent symptoms of COVID-19 respiratory manifestations, are the main symptoms. The dyspnea is found in a range of 54 to 5% of these patients, and cough was found to 3 up to 42%. In the next review and meta-analysis, I presented the time course of the most prevalent respiratory symptoms, which are cough, dyspnea, and here we have chest pain also, which is the third important respiratory symptom. You can see 30 days, 60 days, and 90 days after that the symptoms persist. Please look at the 90 days column. We have a total of 8.6% of people coughing, 26% with dyspnea, and 99.4% with chest pain. And hospitalized patients, compared to the non-hospitalized patients, have more severe clinical picture, according to this, which is a great work on the field. The assessment of pulmonary function after COVID-19 has been reviewed extensively by the European Respiratory Society. You can see a series of what happened here. Okay. You can see a good series of primary work showing that FVC, total lung capacity, and FEV1 are considerably lower after COVID, during the progress of COVID-19, of post-COVID-19. And I left for your attention the last column, referring to DLCO, the diffusion capacity of CO. It is a very sensitive measurement of how oxygen and CO can pass from the lungs to the blood. And this is the most sensitive test for the progress of long COVID. You can see that it is seriously damaged in all the works, and findings exceed the 45 and 50% in several studies. The sensitivity of this test is also shown here in this work. This high column is the effects of long COVID-19 on DLCO. In patients with symptoms, but the value of this work is that it documents that even in patients without any symptom, this DLCO is seriously affected, and the sensitivity of this test is the reason that it should not be omitted from any patient who is examined for the progress of his disease after the acute phase of COVID-19. Another point of respiratory physiology related to the long COVID is its effect on the respiratory muscle performance. We have a reduced respiratory muscle contractility due to the direct effect of virus to the general muscle system. We have a viral-induced myopathy. We have a phrenic nerve injury, sometimes creating unilateral diaphragmatic paralysis. And we have post-mechanical ventilation muscle weakness. And a very interesting point is the effects of COVID-19 on control of breathing. We have a virus which seriously affects the central nervous system. And I have a feeling that most of the previously described psychological and mental disorders after the disease have a clearly organic basis. They are not environmental and psychological effects. There is a damage of the central nervous system, and of course, this includes effects of the virus on the respiratory centers through their central effects on CNS. Another way is that by blocking the ACE2 receptors, they also affect the respiratory drive. And the third way is that the afferent stimuli from the lungs and from the other so many organs suffering from the viral infection, these afferent impulses certainly affect the respiratory drive. Results of these effects is the hyperventilation syndrome, very frequently observed in the long COVID. It is expressed as a PCO2 of less than 35 millimeters of mercury, and in patients with respiratory symptoms is 19%, and without respiratory systems in 13%. Another important issue in respiratory breathing during long COVID is the mouth occlusion pressure. It is a pressure developed in the mouth in two ways. One is during a maximum inspiratory effort, and this is the PI max, which is obviously reduced due to the muscle weakness of the respiratory apparatus. But we also measure the P.1 during quiet breathing. The mouth pressure developed the first 100 milliseconds after an occlusion of inspiratory effort during quiet breathing. This is increased, and this increase denotes that there is a high degree of effort to be done by the respiratory system for a successful inspiration. So P.1 increases, PI max decreases, and the ratio of these two is decreased substantially as a result of COVID effect on the respiratory control of breathing. The increased P.1 is associated with exercise-induced deoxygenation, impaired exercise tolerance, decreased activity productivity, and functional status scale. It is related with clinical situation. There's no doctor who has not seen pictures like this, and it is the radiological findings of long COVID. You can see the diffuse ground glass opacities, you can see the parenchymal bands, you can see the COPE, it is called BOOP, the reticulations and the traction bronchiectasis. You can see the crazy patchy paving and the mosaic in these characteristic of long COVID CTs. This review, and I'm not going to go through the details of it, shows the δεν είμαστε εδώ.
Πήγαινε στο τέλος για αυτό το κλείνει.
Ναι. Ναι, δεν είμαστε εδώ, είναι πιο πριν. Εδώ. Is a description of the frequency and the extension of these findings in different studies, explaining and resulting to the fact that ground glass opacities are found in 42% of patients, reticulations in 53% of patients, and fibrotic lesions in 19% of patients with long COVID. The evolution of these radiological lesions is of three kinds. Some ones are of indeterminate status. Some other ones, especially the ground glass opacities, disappear, and the last ones are irreversible lesions leading to fibrosis. Pulmonary fibrosis is the worst situation, the worst condition which can follow the acute and the long COVID. It happens to 4% of patients who had the duration of illness of 1 week, 24% of patients with a duration of 1 to 3 weeks, and 61% of patients with duration of more than 3 weeks. It happens in patients who had ARDS, and these are 5 to 8% of the total. Supportive management can slightly slow the progress of the disease. It is not curable according to the recent literature. I'm not going to tire you with the pathological pathways underlying the pulmonary fibrosis, but it is related with a generalized systemic inflammatory reaction of the body during the progress of the disease. Important is to see the contributing factors to this situation. And here they are classified into groups. On the right side, on the left side, you can see the patient-related risk factors. Males are affected more than females. Older age, smoking, alcohol abuse, comorbidities like diabetes, obesity, hypertension, chronic pulmonary disease, chronic liver disease, cardiovascular disease, cerebrovascular diseases are factors contributing, risk factors for pulmonary fibrosis. On the right column, you can see the COVID-19 related risk factors that during the long COVID can lead to pulmonary fibrosis. It is the length of hospitalization, the length of ICU, the mechanical ventilation, the high flow nasal oxygen, the presence of ARDS, and the degree of systemic inflammation. Pulmonary embolism is a well-known complication of long COVID. It happens to 5% of these patients, and the underlying mechanism is the systemic inflammation, the endothelitis, coagulation abnormalities, and prolonged immobilization. This is what happens to the patients with long COVID. And closing, I have to say that long COVID-19 is a complex multi-organ syndrome. I am sure that it does exist, to answer the question previously expressed. I'm sure that it is an organic problem, not a theoretically considered issue. It is the respiratory system which is primarily affected, and a lot of measurements has shown it. Cough, dyspnea, and chest pain are the most common symptoms. Both symptomatic and asymptomatic survivors may exhibit persistent abnormalities in chest CT and pulmonary function tests, especially a reduced DLCO. Pulmonary embolism and pulmonary fibrosis are the most severe post-COVID conditions. Thank you for your attention. Did I keep my time? Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Beharakis, for this very detailed and comprehensive presentation on the respiratory symptoms of long COVID, and for making it very clear that it's real, it's a real disease, an organic disease with many manifestations, primarily from the respiratory system and the CNS. And now I give the chair through the internet to Professor De Becker to introduce our next speaker. Please, Professor De Becker.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, indeed, it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Professor David Wood. Professor Wood is Emeritus Professor of Cardiology at Imperial College London, and at this moment is Adjunct Professor of Preventive Cardiology at the National University of Ireland in Galway. I know David since many, many years. We are working together in different respects. He has been also recently, I think, past president of the World Heart Federation. He has been, well, it's difficult to summarize his CV, you know, but he has really been very instrumental in the development, in the promotion of preventive cardiology, not only in Europe, but I think all over the world. He will deal in his presentation with the cardiovascular manifestations of long COVID-19, and I think without any further ado, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Guy, for your kind introduction, and my special thanks to Professor Kokkinos for his invitation to join this seminar. And I am going to address the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic and specifically the implications of this pandemic for prevention of cardiovascular disease. And as we all know, as we all personally experienced, this pandemic has had the most profound political, economic, social, and medical consequences for all our populations. And if you track the pandemic on the WHO coronavirus dashboard, and I last looked at this towards the end of last month, you can see that to that date, there have been over 6 million deaths attributed to COVID-19. And I'd like you to remember that number and to see that number in the context of the burden of cardiovascular disease worldwide. There are two excellent papers released by the European Society of Cardiology, guidance on the diagnosis and management of cardiovascular disease during the pandemic, and I would recommend these as background to this topic. I am going to address the cardiovascular comorbidities which are common in COVID-19, and also show you the evidence that the presence of cardiovascular disease, prevalent disease, increases the risk of both the severity of infection and the risk of death. And I'm also going to demonstrate that cardiovascular risk factors are also associated with more severe infection and increased risk of death. But starting with the cardiovascular comorbidities which have been described in the context of COVID-19, including acute cardiac injury, vascular dysfunction, and thrombosis. And it is well documented that patients with acute COVID-19 infection commonly have elevated troponin levels, although indicating therefore myocardial injury, but this should not be confused necessarily with acute coronary syndrome. There has been some reports that the infection itself can destabilize the plaque, leading to rupture and thrombosis, and therefore STEMI or end-STEMI myocardial infarction. And also case reports of acute myocarditis. And there is also some evidence that the hemodynamic effects of COVID-19 may unmask latent heart failure, or indeed exacerbate existing heart failure, but no direct evidence that COVID-19 is a cause of heart failure. And there is really no substantive documentation of specific arrhythmias in relation to COVID-19. So that leaves us with venous thromboembolic disease, and there have been a large number of different mechanisms which are very well described in this task force paper, including microvascular dysfunction, endothelial dysfunction, and so on. But when it comes to documenting the incidence of acute coronary syndrome specifically related to COVID-19, acute myocarditis specifically related to COVID-19, heart failure and arrhythmias specifically related to COVID-19, the evidence is weak. What is undoubtedly true is the high incidence of venous thromboembolic disease and especially acute pulmonary thromboembolism, which became evident early during the pandemic and led to early anticoagulation of patients with COVID-19. Beyond the direct effect of the virus on the myocardium, COVID-19 had a much bigger impact in relation to the presentation and management of acute coronary syndromes. In this paper published from the Google search engine, you can see that searches for chest pain during the period January and February and March 2020 accelerated across several countries, the USA, Spain, UK, and Italy. People were seeking information on chest pain, short of going to see their doctor or attending an emergency department. And therefore, it's unsurprising to learn that in terms of acute coronary syndrome admissions, and this is based on some 40 studies, if you compare 2019 in the blue with 2020 in the orange, you will see that there was a substantial reduction in admissions of both STEMI and NSTEMI between 2019 and 2020. Patients were reluctant to attend hospital. And as a consequence, and this comes from a prospective ACS registry from 5 continents, as a consequence, there were delays in treatment of acute coronary syndromes with the consequences that you might anticipate. In the blue, you see the median time delay for STEMI patients between symptom onset and admission, and in the red, a BISUS MINAP pre-COVID reference population taken from 2019. And you can see that median time delay significantly increased for STEMI from symptom to admission, and the door to balloon time for STEMI also significantly increased, and the same picture was seen for NSTEMI, significant delay between the onset of symptoms to admission to hospital during the period of the COVID-19 pandemic compared to the pre-COVID period. And as a consequence of this late presentation and late revascularization, angioplasty, stenting, coronary artery bypass grafting, the incidence of cardiogenic shock in the STEMI patients was significantly higher, 3 times higher, and the same for NSTEMI patients. And in-hospital mortality rose fourfold for STEMI patients and more than 5-fold for NSTEMI patients as well. And for patients presenting with an acute coronary syndrome and presenting late and being revascularized late with the ensuing complications, they faced another hurdle, which was the suspension of cardiac rehabilitation programs, with staff moved from cardiac rehabilitations to frontline care. And in this international survey, about half of all cardiac rehabilitation services reported that they had been completely suspended, were seeing no patients whatsoever. 1/3 were seeing fewer patients, just over 10% were seeing as many patients as usual. So COVID-19 had a much more profound effect on cardiovascular disease and specifically on acute coronary syndromes because it resulted in late presentations, more complications, and a higher case fatality, and therefore an increased need for cardiovascular prevention and rehabilitation, which was not available in many centers. Now, let me turn to the impact of COVID-19 on the general population, and specifically in relation to cardiovascular risk and prevalent cardiovascular disease. The data I'm going to show now come from the UK Biobank study based on over 500,000 adults aged between 40 and 69 years. This is a classical prospective longitudinal epidemiological study at which at baseline, at the time of recruitment, the demographics of these adults, their health risk factors, biological measurements, medical conditions, and exposure to environmental factors were all documented. And during COVID, they identified from this large cohort 459 COVID-19 deaths directly attributed to COVID-19 from the period of 31st of January 2020. And they compared the characteristics of these patients, of these people who had died from COVID-19 with 2,626 non-COVID deaths over the same period. And what they found was that older age, being male, coming from ethnic minorities in the UK, particularly Black, African and Asian, being a current smoker, a former drinker, having prevalent cardiovascular disease, hypertension or diabetes, having a history of autoimmune disease or oral steroid use, and importantly for all of us, being a healthcare worker, increased your risk of dying from COVID-19. And all of these factors were independently associated with death from COVID-19. But I want to highlight here how patients with prevalent cardiovascular disease, those who had cardiovascular disease at the time COVID-19 arrived, had a much higher frequency of death from the infection, and those with the antecedents of cardiovascular disease with the major risk factors such as hypertension and diabetes were also at increased risk of dying from COVID-19. And this is quantified in this systematic review and meta-analysis, starting with prevalent cardiovascular disease, people who had cardiovascular disease at the time COVID-19 arrived. The risks of them having more severe infection were fourfold higher by comparison with people without cardiovascular disease, and their risks of dying from COVID-19 was 6 times higher. If you had hypertension or diabetes, your risk of more severe disease was between 2 and 3 times greater, and your risk of dying from COVID-19 was also between 2.5 and 2.9 times greater. And the conclusion that one should draw from these data is that although cardiovascular comorbidities are common in patients with COVID-19, that they have higher troponin levels, for example, or elevated beta-natriuretic peptide, the biggest impact of the pandemic was on late presentation of ACS, delayed revascularization, and higher case fatality. And we have to remember that the presence of cardiovascular disease in the population, prevalent cases, increases the risk of both severity of infection and the risk of death, and the antecedents of that disease namely the major cardiovascular risk factors, specifically hypertension and diabetes, are associated with more severe infection and increased risk of death. In other words, COVID-19 has exposed the vulnerability of unhealthy populations, and especially those with prevalent cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and diabetes. And this makes the most powerful case for secondary, primary, and primordial prevention. Secondary prevention for those who have developed the disease, primary prevention for those at high risk with hypertension or diabetes, and primordial prevention at a population level to build healthy, more resilient people. Now, in 2019, there were 17 million deaths attributed to cardiovascular disease, and 6.4 million of these deaths were premature. That is to say, they occurred in people under the age of 70 years. And I showed you this dashboard at the beginning, and here we have just over 6 million deaths reported to WHO as due to COVID-19. But this is not the complete picture. And earlier this year, WHO published a very important statistical analysis based on global excess deaths associated with COVID-19 between the period January 2020 and 2021. And in that 24-month period, there were just over 5 million deaths directly attributed to COVID-19, COVID-19 written, as it were, on the death certificate. But there were 14.9 million excess deaths by comparison with the same time periods prior to the arrival of COVID-19. And many of these deaths will have been not just due to COVID-19, which may not have been correctly diagnosed.
Delta, we saw a lot of post-COVID problems and long COVID, but Omicron has been relatively easier to treat in long COVID and post-COVID follow-up. An American study recently published in Nature, using the electronic medical records from the Department of Veterans Affairs, looking into millions of cases, found that previous vaccination reduces risk of long COVID by 15%, which is much less to what had been recorded before, which was around 50%. The common thread here is that vaccination is better than no vaccination, but we don't have precise information about that. So this is the theory, and these are some of the information we now have and the knowledge we have about the complexity of the condition. We are aware of some of the remaining questions about long COVID, but we also need to be very practical now. So this is the patient pathway suggested. So it looks very simple on paper. So 3 stages. Number 1, a patient reports a symptom, is assessed, stage 2, and then, depending on the severity of the condition, is triaged into, if diagnosed with long COVID, through the self-management pathway, or if more severe, through the primary care management, or if more severe, a referral to the specialist service. And a little bit, this is the NHS long COVID patient pathway. So again, quite logical, reasonable on paper. A patient reports a symptom, is assessed in primary care, is offered investigations, is or not diagnosed with long COVID, and if so, then 3 routes: self-management if very mild symptoms, primary care management, or if severe symptoms, then referral to a long COVID service. But what are the possible pitfalls or gaps, particularly in Greece, with regards to this pathway? So number one, patient information. So for someone to report a symptom, they need to be informed to be able to pick up on the symptoms they have and associate it with possible long COVID. Number two, GP assessment. The reality in Greece is that there is a significant variability in terms of how much primary care each of us Greeks receives. So our health system is now in a stage of transition. There is a lot of effort underway to develop a network of primary care physicians. So this second step is a possible problem as well. And then the training of the physicians to be able to pick up the symptoms and assess appropriately, investigate appropriately, and then refer appropriately. So this is the reality in Greece. These are all the 22 post-COVID clinics in Greece, so 5 in Athens. Well, actually more than 5 hospitals, but only the Soteria Hospital we have 5 post-COVID clinics, and also the rest of Greece. For example, only Samos has a post-COVID service. There are big chunks of Greece, particularly Sterea Ελλάδα, which doesn't have access to post-COVID service. And then we have 2 specialized long COVID clinics, which are 2, one in Evangelismos Hospital and the other one in Papageriou in Thessaloniki. So these are the hubs. This is the work that is being done from the beginning of the pandemic that has developed over the last 2.5 years. And also, as I said before, we have a very vocal, organized patient body with their own website, with lots of information, news, personal stories, videos, so very, very active since the beginning of the pandemic. And also the Hellenic Respiratory Society published guidelines on long COVID, which have also been recently reviewed. Just summarizing now to complete the talk. So given these issues we have, particularly in Greece, these are the 3 main areas that we are now focusing on. So number 1, working with the public. This means education, clinical guidance, materials, even online presence. Second, building the knowledge. So training for professionals are opportunities to do research or participate in research projects. Navigating the study, there is enormous effort in literature to produce new results and participate in big studies. We still need to know the risk factors, the prevalence, what's the effect of long COVID in daily activities, and also who is at risk. And finally, improving the service we already have in place. We know that data collection is paramount. We don't have a post-COVID or long COVID registry, a national one. We know that what doesn't get measured will not get done. And also there is the issue, as Professor Burch mentioned, the issue of access to service. So the patients who are more at risk, the groups that are more at risk, we don't know whether they have the same access as everyone else. So I'm concluding this talk with yesterday's interview. I think Professor Ebden already mentioned that. Dr. Anthony Fauci, who has been a very visible and respected figure in the pandemic, gave an interview to The Guardian yesterday to say that long COVID is a public health emergency, can be debilitating. We know that it affects 10 to 20% of COVID survivors. There's no diagnostic test. That doesn't mean that we don't have investigations to run, but there's not one simple way out of this. And also, it's affecting disproportionately the minorities and the disadvantaged groups. So To finish, this pandemic has been for many of us, particularly the younger professionals, the first collective experience of our life. We have heard time and time again that the virus does not discriminate, but we need to make sure that we keep working to make sure that those at risk at most continue to get the care they need, and we continue to support them. So that's it for me. Thank you again for having me, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk about long COVID in reference to the health system and for the experience for the Greek situation, which is of interest to everyone, I think. Professor De Becker, the microphone is yours for closing the seminar.
Thank you very much indeed. I think that we have come at this moment to a closure of this really excellent first and second session of this, what we are calling educational seminar. I think that we thank, of course, first of all, the speakers for their excellent contributions. We also thank the audience for the interest in attending this seminar. And I would like to thank all those who contributed to the preparation of this educational seminar. And let me just mention one name, just thank particularly Dennis Kokinos, past president of our association, who I think has been the driving force in the preparation of this excellent event. Thank you very much, all of you, and have a good evening.
Thank you. So this seminar comes to a close. Thanks to everyone, and see you in the future, in the near future.